welcome to the Ferret's annual general meeting. Well, I mean, I say meeting, we're all at home looking at our screens, but we hope that we'll be transmitting some Ferret warmth this morning that's going to transcend our virtual limitations. And it's raining a bit anyway, so it's probably for the best. I'm Karen Goodwin. I am a co-editor of the Ferret, along with Billy Briggs, since Rob Edwards stepped back to focus on more journalism this summer. And sorry, just lost that. And I was also previously the organisation's chair. That slot's now held by Peter Gahan, who we'll hear from later. So we're going to start off just by going through some of the formal business of the AGM. And so I've been joined this morning by our panel of lovely directors, who I'll introduce you all to just in a minute. We'll talk a little bit about our structure, just cover some AGM business just as quickly as we can. And then we'll be joined by Joyce McMillan, theatre critic, arts and political columnist for The Scotsman, who will be interviewing our very own Peter Gahan about his book, Democracy for Sale, which came out just a couple of months ago. So we'll take questions after that. You can type them just in the comments below, so please do so. We'll return to just a little roundup of what we've been up to over the year, and our readers' survey will be presented by Ali Tibbett. So we'll take some final members' questions and be finished up by 1:30 at the latest, just in time for a late Saturday lunch. So first up, I'd like to thank all of our directors from last year. The way it works is we all officially stand down at the AGM and we can reapply for our directorships at that point. So we're sorry to be losing two valued directors this year, our co-founder Billy Briggs and independent director Leila Roxanne Hill, who decided not to reapply for director roles. So we're sorry to lose them, and we hugely appreciate their commitment and energy and time that they've given to the Ferret over several years. So to make up for that loss, we've had some new faces join us. We've not had to hold an election this year because the number of applications matched the number of places on our board, which is great news for us anyway. To explain to those who are not familiar with our cooperative structure, we have places for 6 journalist directors who must already be published on the Ferret. And we've got 3 reader directors who are members, and we appoint 2 independent directors who will become members if they are not already when they take up board positions. Members become owners of the Ferret, so this is your first reminder that I've been given strict instructions to give you throughout. If you're not already a Ferret member, you can subscribe at theferret.scot/subscribe. So, with no further ado, just to introduce this year's board. As journalist directors, we're delighted to have Rob Edwards. You can give a wave to say hello when your name's called. We've got Peter Gahan, who's chairing. Me, Karen Goodwin. We've got Caitlin Logan, who's joining us as a new director. Jamie Mann. And another new director, Margaret Taylor. For our reader directors, we have Fiona Davidson. I'm going to give a wave. Bob Elliott, Susan Cochrane, and as our independent directors this year, we have Audra Merrick and we have Alistair Tibbett. So welcome all. We're really delighted about the expertise that we've got here and really pleased that our board this year reflects a better gender balance than we maybe had in previous years. So that's a really important target for us to meet. As I said, there's a mix of familiar faces, making sure I don't say old here, as well as new ones. And I just wondered if we could maybe ask the new directors just to say hi, introduce themselves, just very quickly tell us a little bit about what you do. So I wonder if we could start in reverse order with Audra.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Audra. I live in Glasgow. I'm an independent consultant, and I do a lot of digital strategy, but my background is in media and publishing.
Fantastic, thanks. Susan, do you want to say hi?
Hi everyone, I'm Susan. I live in East Ayrshire near the Galloway Forest. I work on safety of journalist issues. I'm currently leading a project looking at risks and threats to investigative journalists who work on financial crime and corruption at the Foreign Policy Centre, which is a think tank based out of London. So really pleased to be here and be more involved.
Fantastic, thanks. We've also got Margaret Taylor. Do you want to say hi?
Hi there. Hi. I've been a journalist for almost 20 years, started out in local news, been a freelance since the start of this year. Prior to that, I was at the Herald for 3.5 years on the business desk, wrote a column and also did legal coverage, having spent 9 years at Trade Magazine, The Lawyer. So a lot of my focus is on legal issues and financial type issues, which I've done a few stories for the Ferret with that kind of focus.
Fantastic, thank you. And Caitlin, lastly.
Oh, she's muted.
Oh, sorry, Caitlin.
Hi, sorry. I'm Caitlin. I've been living in Fife for the past 2 years. But still sort of weirdly consider myself to be in Glasgow somehow. I'm a freelance journalist and columnist, and I write things for the Sunday National, and more recently in the National as well. And you might have noticed I've been writing some things recently for the Ferret. Issues that I'm kind of specifically really interested in relate to like equality, social justice and human rights, and I also work in comms in the charity sector as well.
Fantastic, thanks so much. It's really lovely to have you join us. I feel like we've got a really great board going forward, as we'll hear later on. You know, like everyone else, we're facing enormous challenges just now, as well as having loads of exciting things going on. So we'll go through some of the highlights of the year, as well as, you know, what we want to achieve going forward. Hopefully everyone has been sent a copy of our annual report. I think maybe Ali was going to put that into the comments as well. And we'll come to that just after we've spoken to Peter and Joyce. So just a quick piece of AGM business that we have to do legally for our members. We are asking members this year to vote on disavowing the need to have our accounts audited. There's more information in that in email, and you should all have been sent a poll, which is on Lumio. It was sent to your email, and again, I think we're going to put a link to that in the comments. So rather than asking everyone to vote as we would do at our usual annual general meeting, if you could just vote using that poll, so please just log on, vote there. It's going to be available for another 7 days. Once we've collected the votes there, then we'll send an update to our members to say whether this motion has passed or not and what that will mean in terms of how your money is audited. So if you could just forward that link, then that would be great. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule, but I don't know if Joyce is with us already watching and if she's around to log on. Might have to go maybe to some highlights of the year and come back to that. No, not yet. Okay. So, in terms of our year so far, I'll just speak a little about that, and when Joyce is able to join us, we'll go then to Peter. So we've had a really busy year, as you can imagine. We've had you know, a number of stories that have been our real kind of high impact stories that have reached you know, record numbers of readers. Our audience has gone up this year by 82%. More people visited our website compared with the previous year, and there were 55% more page views on the website than on the previous 12 months. The number of people who get our weekly Ferret Underground members, our email is now 3.6k. And if you're not already subscribed to our email, then please do sign up, and you can get our weekly news, highlights of stories. We also do a digest there for anybody who wants to just see what other investigative journalism is going on in Scotland. The number of people who have opted to get daily notifications from the Ferret is now 24.5k, so we're really delighted that that's going up as well. We've got people coming to visit the Ferret from a wide variety of sources, including 24% who say they've changed their mind about an issue after reading a Ferret story. So very important for us to be having impact. 31% of people who are Ferret visitors say they've contacted a politician after reading one of our stories. So we've got those stories that have really had an impact have been on a wide range of topics this year. We've had, I suppose, one of our main kind of challenges has been how to cover COVID-19, which has been absolutely unprecedented, has been changing our lives in every single way we can think of. We've looked with our fact-checking service at debunking all the myths that have been around about COVID. So over the months of lockdown, we published over 40 fact checks, and it became our most well-read page of the year. We regularly updated that, and I think that really kind of showed that people were just really hungry for information about really what the facts were. We've also really focused again on social affairs stories. Our 4-part series, Just Surviving, was a collaboration with the Huffington Post at the end of last year. It was looking at the challenges of people facing poverty, and came just at the end of 10 years of austerity. At that point, we couldn't possibly have known what other challenges lay ahead of us and just how differently we might think about austerity at that point. But over that 4-part series, we looked at care leavers, disabled people, drug users in Dundee, and the series was shortlisted for an Amnesty Media Awards, which just happened last month. We were also commissioned by the People's Postcode Lottery with journalist Sian Norris to investigate female genital mutilation across the UK. The story was published in Open Democracy and the Ferret and incorporated really specialist learning resources, and was taken on by an educational publisher as well. We've had a series of stories this year looking at proposals for peat extraction, which were opposed by environmental groups. And following our report, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency strengthened its policy in that area. And one was to refuse planning permission. Another was about planning application being withdrawn. So again, those stories really kind of had impact in the real world. We've continued as well to report on freedom of information, which has been such an important issue for the Ferret just throughout its history. This year we provided in-depth coverage of attempts by the Scottish Government to use emergency COVID laws to restrict FOI rights, and we gave evidence on the topic as well to the Holyrood Committee about the restrictions were about the fact that the restrictions were subsequently overturned by MSPs at vote. One of our big projects this year came from our readers and members, and we ran a series of stories about property ownership over the year. That revealed that 4.4 billion worth of Scottish land is now owned in tax havens, and we published a searchable database of each property and reported on calls to the Scottish Government to publish information as open data. That database is still available, and we'd really love to see more of our members going into the database, looking for local links that they can make to that information and suggesting story ideas to us. We've already run stories on particular parts of Edinburgh, on Amazon, on land use in various towns and cities across Scotland, but we'd love to do more. So please do have a look and let us know what we should do next. Following freedom of information requests to every council in Scotland, we were also able to compile a database of common goods spending for the whole country. And we revealed these funds were declined in value over the last 10 years, prompting concerns about council mismanagement. We also worked earlier last year with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, continuing on their homeless deaths investigation, which was a really kind of harrowing discovery about the number of people that were dying while homeless. We were really glad that the National Registers of Scotland agreed to publish stats on homeless deaths for the first time last year, with the new figures revealing that Scotland has the highest homeless deaths anywhere in the UK, which was really quite a sort of sobering discovery. Just going to go back to see if Joyce is able to log on with us at this point. And maybe while we're waiting, Peter, do you have any remarks as chair? I know that you wrote a chair's report for us, just looking at some of the challenges and the highlights of our year, and also just where we're going from here.
Yes, the chair's report is available. It should be available for everyone to read. Includes, I think it might be the first time we've quoted Lenin at the start of the chair's report. Sorry, apologies for that. Just like that quote so much about, you know, there's some years, there's some decades in which nothing happens, and there are some weeks in which decades happen. And it does feel like one of those years. It's been a very busy year. We've done a lot. There's a lot of challenges, of course. We're not alone. There's a lot of challenges across the media. We have, you know, what we are trying to do, like we have, this is not news to anybody. We have had a grant renewed from Luminate, which is great, but that grant is all about, you know, I'm feeding back quite a lot, is all about trying to make us sustainable and build a sustainable organization, which is what we're really trying to do, and we're working very hard to try and deliver that. I think there's huge opportunities for us as well into the future. I've been very pleased and heartened that our membership continues to grow despite the challenges of that. It's been hard as well, because a lot of things like this, like our AGM, we would not like to be doing like this. You know, it's always been a big part of our year to all get together, and we've had some great AGM events. And I feel like the last one that really swings to mind is the time Michael Sheen was there, and his beard and his hair look like mine does now. So I'm really disappointed he can't be here now in person, so I could meet him and we could do a Michael Sheen and Peter Gagan moment. But that's not going to happen this year. Maybe he'll come next year if we do it in person. But yeah, no, I think suffice to say, like, there's a lot of positive things, and I think there's, you know, what we're trying to do is to kind of grow and develop as an organization. We're really keen to get more and more people involved, and thank you to everybody who has taken time out of their Saturday morning to listen to this, you know, to kind of attend our virtual AGM. And we're hopeful that we're going to be able to do more and more things online as well, because obviously that's going to be where we're going to be for a while with it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Peter. We'll hear a little bit more about our plans for the future and coming kind of months and onwards afterwards. But first of all, I'd just like to thank Joyce McMillan for joining us. She's here to talk to, or to interview Peter about his book, Democracy for Sale. It's about how money, vested interests and digital skullduggery are eroding trust in democracy, and what must be done about it. So Joyce is here to tease out a little bit more about that. We're delighted that she's joining us. Joyce is an arts and political commentator for many years, hugely respected across Scotland. She's been involved in many campaigns for democracy and human rights, both in Scotland and internationally, and she's been a freelance journalist based in Edinburgh for more than 25 years. Joyce, I'm going to hand over to you to find out a little bit more from Peter about the inspiration for the book, what it's all about, and what it tells us about where we are today. If people could add some questions in the comments, I'll pop back on and take those to Peter and to Joyce as well. So thanks very much to all the directors for joining us just now, and we'll see you a little bit after we've heard from Joyce and Peter. Thanks.
Joyce, I can't hear you.
Is that it now? Yeah.
That's it. Lovely to see you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Karen. It's great to hear about the ferrets. I just heard the kind of report on your year of activities there, and obviously I'm very aware of it because as a member of the Ferret, I get I get the information regularly about the Ferret's top stories, and it's become such an important presence in the Scottish media scene over quite a short period, really, by the standards of other publications and broadcasting organisations. So it really is a tremendous achievement, and I'd like to congratulate everyone that's involved with the Ferret and say how pleased I am to be here at the AGM and talking to the chair of the Ferret, which is no small responsibility, Peter Geoghegan, who is himself, of course, one of Britain's leading investigative journalists now. Peter's book, recently published, I think in August of this year, which is called Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. And this is what it looks like. If anybody feels like rushing into a bookstore, picking it up by visual cues only, is a really, well, it's an acclaimed, I think it's fair to say, study of where we are in the practice of democracy at the moment, given the sort of breakneck speed of the changes in the way that democracy happens that have been caused by the advent of social media and internet campaigning. And obviously, Peter's concern in the book, as you can tell by the name of it, is to do with the role that dark money, in the sense of money whose origins are obscure and which is not properly registered in any way that we would normally recognise for political donations, is now playing in our politics. So, Peter, first of all, talk a bit about how this book and the theme of it relates to the work you were doing before, if you know what I mean. I mean, you've already been involved in investigative journalism, you're involved with the Ferret, you're obviously an editor of Open Democracy, which is one of the sort of leading independent news websites in the UK. So, you know, how did the work that you were doing at the time when you began to think about this book connect and lead you into this subject?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for the very kind comments about the book choice. That's very much appreciated, and I'm very, very generous. Yeah, well, so in many ways, you know, my career, like this book started. Now, I won't rehearse the opening of the book because anyone who's heard me talk about it will know the story I tell about how I came across the DUP's donation into the Brexit campaign, which kind of was the kind of catalyst for a lot of this research. But that was back in 2016, and I was covering politics for the Irish Times. But by that stage as well, the Ferret had already started. I'd been working for Channel 4 for quite a while. I'd been on the Channel 4 Dispatches training scheme, and I'd been, you know, working as an investigative journalist. One of the things I found really fascinating because before kind of getting into doing more investigative work, I'd done a lot of political reporting, and I felt like, and I think a lot of people who cover politics feel like there's a Venn diagram which includes the kind of lobby as we know it, whether that's in Holyrood or Westminster, that covers the day-to-day events of politics. You know, some people might say, and I would kind of go along with this, sometimes it can get a bit too theatrical, it can focus too much on personalities, but I understand it's trying to keep up to date with what's happening every day. So what's happening in Parliament, what are political parties saying? But there's another aspect of politics I think doesn't get covered as much, which is the kind of long-term trends of politics and the stuff that goes on underneath, the kind of things that like you don't see, the things that don't happen in plain sight, the things that happen behind the scenes. And often, I think traditionally, a lot of times, lobby journalists, for loads of reasons, haven't really focused so much on the second type of politics. We've seen politics primarily as a thing that takes place in a public forum, as you know, as a kind of, if you want to call a shouting match in Parliament, by all means. And that is an important part of a representative democracy, and it needs to be covered. And I'm not saying it doesn't. But I think historically that second bit, that bit about what goes on behind the scenes, the kind of things like lobbying, the kind of things like political donations, the way in which money works in a political system hasn't had the same kind of focus. And what was really interesting for me is this started with this one story, as I mentioned, about the Democratic Unionist Party, DUP, which I did for Open Democracy with Adam Ramsey in early 2017, which was looking at this huge donation that went to the DUP, almost £500,000 before the Brexit referendum. We still don't know where that money came from because of donor secrecy that was in place in Northern Ireland at the time, which meant that political donations were kept secret. So that was an interesting story, and it caused a big stir, particularly in in Northern Ireland. Annoyingly, it didn't cause much of a stir at all in the UK, because every news editor I spoke to beforehand was saying, well, it's not important, it's not interesting because it's Northern Ireland. But it's the Brexit referendum. It's one constituency. You know, whether the money went through Northern Ireland, it was spent in Britain. Almost all of that money, bar £10,000, was spent in GB, so not in Northern Ireland. And then, interestingly, when the Democratic Unionist Party became kingmakers after Theresa May's botched snap general election in May of 2017, my phone started melting with all the phone calls coming from editors in London going, can we do this for television? Have we got something more? And I think that's quite indicative, actually, of this way of seeing politics purely through the kind of theatre and the kind of what's happening just in the Parliament, rather than looking at the kind of longue durée and the underlying kind of threads of it. But what was interesting to me was, after doing that story, I joined Open Democracy about a year later full time, and I started looking a lot more. I started writing stories about other aspects of the Brexit referendum. You know, things like how the Leave campaign was funded, which was subsequently found to have broken the law in part because of reporting that myself and other colleagues had done. Also, Aaron Banks, who did a lot of work into that, looking into this big man who gave this huge amount of money to the Brexit campaign and how that had worked. But I found myself asking more generally, well, how does money work in our political system? How does money get into the system, and how does it change it? And how is it able to get into the system in ways that we can't see? And what was really interesting was, once I started looking at that, I was amazed at how much was going on that I hadn't seen really covered massively. You know, Private Eye and places like that have covered these kind of stories for a long time, but especially when it came to the book, I was really keen to try and tell these stories in a narrative way. So something like Private Eye, which I will read every week, you know, I always want to see, God, what's this think tank doing that I'm interested in? These kind of anonymously funded think tanks, which I write a lot about. Yeah. They're often on the media. They're very influential. So I'm kind of following that sort of story. But actually, for readers or for people beyond the day-to-day of it, I think it's quite hard for them to engage with what these things mean. So one of the things that I found myself doing when I started this work was, I was drawing on the kind of things I'd done before as an investigative journalist, using publicly registered documents, using things like, electoral registers, electoral commission returns, all that kind of work. What I was also was the kind of traditional nuts and bolts journalism of finding sources who worked for political campaigns. So we did, myself, my colleague Jenna Cordroyd, Open Democracy, did a series of very big investigations to Aaron Banks's campaigns. And we tracked down a lot of people who'd worked for the campaign back in 2016, spoke to them, was able to figure out the difference between what they were saying and what they had documentary evidence and what was being said in public. And, and that's kind of traditional nuts and bolts journalism. But it's the kind of stuff that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources to go and do that kind of work. But the more I started to do this work, the more I started to realize actually there's gaping holes all over the place here. It wasn't just the Brexit referendum. The Brexit referendum was in many ways the kind of apogee of a series of kind of gaping holes in our democracy and the way it's regulated that continued to this day. And what I was trying to do with the book was to really try and tell that whole story. And Brexit, in many ways, is not the subject of the book. It's more the kind of the backdrop against which this took place. But it's because it's a key moment, I think it's really fascinating to see how really quite small sums of money can shift our politics. And what I did, as well as the big thing, the book in many ways is a kind of a narrative story of a lot of investigations I'd done and other people like Carol Cadwallader at The Guardian and lots of other people had done put together. But I also did a number of kind of original interviews for the book. Everyone from kind of people like Steve Bannon to Tory MPs I spoke to for it. But possibly the most interesting interview I had was with a former government minister called Guto Bebb, a former Tory minister, who used to be in the European Research Group. And the European Research Group emerged as this kind of hard Brexit group that were in the kind of the back of the Conservative Party, came out of nowhere, it seemed, and became really kind of influential in the last couple of years. And I think have really shifted where Britain is. But Guto Bebb, who left them, and he talked to me very frankly about what it was like in the European Research Group. But he also said something really interesting. He was like, in America, you have to spend millions and millions of dollars, to get a hearing. And he's like, if I was in Britain, I'd just give £250,000 to a think tank, and Bob's your uncle. You can get all the access and all the influence you want. I think that's really striking that even a former government minister would say that on the record. And at the time, he was still a sitting MP. And so that's the kind of world that I was trying to narrate. I'm trying to kind of lift the lid on a bit in my book.
Yeah, well, it's completely fascinating, and you're right. There's not an awful lot of coverage of it. And you've talked a wee bit about the sort of methods that you used. Did you find there were any really major obstacles to doing that research, or given the amount of power and influence that's involved, was it surprisingly easy? Not in the sense of easy that it didn't take a lot of work and a lot of effort, but I mean, where did you get the sense that anyone was trying to throw kind of obstacles into your path?
Oh yes, every day pretty much. There's another book to be written about the legal battles, and there's stuff that's not in that book because of the threat of defamation. This is an ongoing problem, and the Ferret's been very much, I'm pleased to say, at the vanguard of pushing for defamation reform in Scotland. There's a huge problem that there's no defamation reform in Northern Ireland at all, and there won't be any defamation reform in Northern Ireland. So I have a stack of solicitors' letters from Northern Ireland. Almost all are spurious claims, many of which have now passed into, there's a set time limit within which you have to start legal proceedings against someone. But when someone powerful, when an MP, as has happened to me, is threatening to sue you personally, and they can find out the value of your home, your livelihood is potentially on the line. There's a huge chilling effect for sure. And this is something that happens frequently. We've had an open democracy where we had the Charity Commission looking into us after someone we rewrote about complained to the Charity Commission, a very, very prominent British politician, a very prominent person in the Brexit story, didn't like our reporting. So no, it's a huge problem, and especially for small organisations, whether it's open democracy or my day job is the Ferret, where I'm the chair, it is a continual challenge. And what's particularly difficult with it is the capacity for vexatious I was going to say vexatious litigation, but it's not litigation, because rarely are these actually litigated. It's vexatious threats of litigation, but which really gum up a small organisation. If you can imagine, say you're one or two, a team is being grand to say, no, I operate a team. There's really me and one colleague full time, and some other ancillary colleagues around me in terms of this particular work that I do. And if you get a couple of legal letters, even every 6 months from a couple of people, that takes up a lot of time. You're having to engage with your lawyers, it's a lot of time, and people know this. And it's a way, I think, of putting pressure on you not to do things. I'm not saying it stopped me from doing some things, but it does make life much more difficult. I've been very lucky. I've been very supported. A lot of this work was done at Open Democracy, and my boss, Mary Fitzgerald, the editor-in-chief, is incredibly supportive of this work. And without that, we've had funders who've helped it with it too, and that's been great. And people have subscribed to it and helped it. But in terms of actually, there's a lot of people who don't want to have these kind of conversations out there and will threaten legal action. And that is a huge problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of these things are covered less. Even just as we're talking yesterday, Karen Wallader was in court with Aaron Banks, and there's a huge, and that will put a chilling effect on people. And it puts a my book had to go through, it had to be fine-tooth combed before it could be published, and that's a huge challenge. And it's a challenge actually when it comes to writing things like this as well. I found, and I was a bit wary of my book. I thought some people would find it a bit dense because, as a journalist, even when writing a book, the best you can do really as an investigative journalist is put the evidence down there and let people make up their own mind about it. And partly that's to do with defamation laws as well.
Obviously, a lot of what you're exposing here is, as you've said, kind of gaping holes both in electoral legislation and in areas like defamation and so on, which would prevent the investigation of it. But this book mainly focuses on the complete inadequacy, really not fit for purpose, of the regulation of elections and of spending on elections, and on the way that using various sort of, modern, 21st century ways of funding people can completely bypass what regulations that exist. And in any case, those regulations are very, very weakly enforced. And we now have a UK government that is kind of threatening to abolish the Electoral Commission, which is the only feeble sort of mechanism that we have for enforcing this. So obviously there's a job of work to be done in terms of kind of reforming legislation that would start to deal with some of these issues. But do you get the sense that anybody wants to do that work? Is there any political party that you feel is interested? Is there any viable force in UK or Scottish politics that is actually interested in taking this up and doing something about it?
And I think that's, Joyce, that is the kind of huge question when it comes down to this. There's lots of stuff. I talk a little bit in my book about the kind of things that you could do to improve the situation. It's like the small change you can make that would have a huge difference. You could, like, because I think in Britain we tend to always look at America, and we always tend to compare ourselves to America, and we kind of rank where we think we are based on America. And when it comes to things like electoral malfeasance and money in politics, we go, we're not as bad as America. There's way more money in America. It's not that bad here. Two things I have about that, and I think I thought the same about this until I started doing all this work. Really, I just kind of common sense, can't be that bad. America, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Here, it's like 50 grand will get you into the Tory leaders group, and you can have 4 off-the-record meetings with the Prime Minister and cabinet ministers every year. How bad can it be? But actually, that's how bad it is, actually, because there's two big differences. One is that in Britain, it means actually because political parties run on private money, and there's not that much private money of it about, there's much greater opportunities for access. We saw that during the summer with this scandal with Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, housing secretary, who's still in post, who's still a cabinet secretary for housing, despite admitting, and I quote, apparent bias in overruling his local officials to give planning permission to Tory donor Richard Desmond for a massive development in the Isle of Dogs in East London, in Tower Hamlets, that saved Mr. Desmond an estimated £45 million in this kind of community charge, which would have just come in 24 hours earlier. We have the text messages between Desmond and Jenrick, where Desmond is saying, we don't want to give the Marxists in Tower, basically the people in Tower Hamlets Council, one of the poorest councils in the whole of Britain, we don't want to give them this dough. And Robert Jenrick changes his decision on that. And that happened after Desmond sat next to Jenrick and showed him a video of this development at a Tory fundraiser in which Desmond bought a table that was 12 grand. It's nothing. This man's
nothing to him.
Huge amounts. So small amounts of money can go a big way in Britain. But the other thing that we have in Britain as well is we don't want to talk about we don't look at what happens in other countries that aren't America. So if you look at France, the maximum private donation in France is about €7,500. You could have a maximum donation in Britain of £10,000. That would go a long way to taking big money out of politics. But we don't do that. And there's a bunch of reasons why. And I think the point you make about, I don't think it's easy to, like, the Conservatives are the party of government now for 10 years. So unsurprisingly, the sleaze and corruption is all going to be around the party of government. But opposition parties aren't blameless on this either. They've not made much running on it. And probably one of the most telling quotes in my book is from Stephen Kinnock, who's a Labour MP and who's involved with the, it's an all-party parliamentary group looking at kind of electoral regulation. And he basically says, it's almost like a turkey's voting for Christmas. Politicians know the system doesn't work, but they think that they know how to make it work for them. So they don't want to change it. And part of the problem is that, if you think about a general election in Britain, it's 650 mini elections. And everybody who's won their mini election, every MP has won an election. They've won their mini elections. We don't have proportional representation. So you have to top the poll in your place. Otherwise, you do not get a seat in Parliament. All those MPs feel like they know how to work that system at a local level. There's, like I mentioned it in the book. In Britain, the maximum spending is about, it varies by constituency for a general election, but it's about £12,000 to £15,000. Nobody thinks that each MP only spends that on their campaigning. And it's really funny, whenever the campaign spending comes out after every general election, I sadly look at it. And you've got these, like the number of people who register 99% of spending. I saw Jeremy Hunt register 99.98% of spending in the last general election. Like, that's just farcical. Absolutely farcical. And what happens is spending takes place, but it's written off as national. But it's actually local spending. So, and the reason I bring this up is because at the root, at the very kind of nub of the core bit of how we regulate our elections is basically a farce. And we all know it's a farce, and all the MPs know it's a farce. But the fact that that still exists as a farce, I think, kind of speaks to a much bigger problem, because you can see that, from the very foundations, there's no willingness for change. And I think that's the biggest kind of challenge. And I want, to me, it has to come, or if it's going to come, it has to come from politicians feeling like there is a cost to be paid, an electoral cost to be paid for this. You have a piece coming out in the London Review of Books next week, which talks about some of the history of electoral regulation too. And the Standards Commissioner only exists it only dates back to 1994. It was when John Major set it up. And that was after the Cash for Questions scandal. And basically, John Major, the Tories were in huge, sleaze was just this word every week. It was sleaze, sleaze, sleaze. And John Major felt he had to do something about it. It didn't do him any favours in the end. The Tories got trounced in 1997 anyway. But he felt he had to do something. And that's because he felt like this was something that was losing the party votes. And I think that's the thing. I think it has to come to the point where politicians feel as if actually by breaking the rules, something bad is going to happen. And I think until we get there, we're not going to see much change.
Yeah, gosh. Well, that's a challenge to any democracy activist to try and think of a way of making them feel something bad would happen. I mean, maybe what we need is a network of 600, in all the constituencies across the UK, 600 little groups of local activists that just take down every detail of the spending of each candidate in their local, election, general election, and publish it, and try and get it published in whatever local media is still standing. That would be interesting.
I'm all for that. I think I actually do. I think there's a need for the kind of people who are engaged, the kind of people who are campaigning, the kind of people who are the lifeblood of the civil society organisations, or the lifeblood of a democracy, to see these sort of issues as something that they should engage with too.
Peter, I think certainly on the kind of Remainer centre left, the sort of wheel thinking people are really shocked and upset by the Brexit result and tend to see it as tending towards the illegitimate because of the overspending that took place and all the rest of it. There's a kind of feeling, there is a tendency to slightly personalise these issues. And there is a feeling that the reason why the situation seems so glaringly bad at the moment is not just because, there probably are structural problems of the kind we've just been talking about, but it's also because there are some really bad people out there trying to undermine the political process, to publish fake news under the guise of facts. The very first, before the bit in your book where you talk about seeing the wraparound advert on the metro in Newcastle that was paid for by the DUP dark money, you mentioned meeting this man on the platform who said he was going to vote for Brexit because he was so worried about the fact that Turkey was going to join the EU. Something that Turkey has been angling for unsuccessfully for at least 30 years, and which is clearly not going to happen. And of course, that was one of the fake adverts that was published on Facebook by the Leave campaign, and completely false, along with the ones about how the EU were forcing us to be cruel to polar bears, were forcing us to be cruel to other animals. There was these weird fictional adverts targeted at people that they could tell from their algorithms didn't really previously have much engagement with politics. When you're confronted with actors who are prepared to do things like that, is it possible that there just isn't a system, particularly when they've got money behind them, that there just isn't a system that can resist that kind of, malign intent, if you like?
I think that's a really good question. I don't think you have to go back to the Brexit referendum. If you don't think about the 2019 general election that happened just in December, although it does feel like a long time ago because of this strange kind of, at least it does to me, year that we've had. But, if you look back to then, you had the Conservative Party rebranded their Twitter account as a fact-checking account during a live television debate and then doubled down on it. Michael Gove refused to say it was a bad thing and basically said we would do it again. The Conservatives also bought adverts on Google for a fake Labour manifesto. So if you typed in Labour manifesto into Google, you'd get a fake manifesto created by Conservative Party social media people. They'd hired these guys, Topham Guerin, who were like a kind of really, really hard-nosed New Zealand kind of political comms team to do all this sort of messaging for them, and very much intentionally so. And there's a huge, so we can see this has always been the problem. It's the kind of Dominic Cummings model of government where if you are willing to be as hardline as you want, if you are willing to keep pushing the envelope and keep going further and further than your opponents, at the moment you will emerge victorious, and there will be almost no comeback for it, because it's kind of this, what Steve Bannon calls flooding the zone. He means it's flooding the zone with shit, basically. You push as much stuff out there and you create so much noise that no one knows what's actually going on, and people are incapable or feel like they're not able to parse fact from fiction, and then often just switch off. And I think that's part of it. It's almost an anti-democratic sentiment at the root of it. It's not about trying to court a debate. It's actually trying to kind of block off debate by kind of pushing out kind of messaging. And that's been the big, huge change, I think, of the last, when it comes to electoral politics. In many ways, like, my book is kind of dealing with a series of interconnected issues, and the internet kind of runs through them. I talk a lot about, how election law doesn't work. I talk a lot about how lobbying works, but also the role of the internet in facilitating this and facilitating those kind of things like targeted advertisements, things like, anonymous campaigns, basically being able to spend huge sums of money. And, just for a good example of how outdated, because basically we have analog rules for digital age. So for example, if you are running for an election and you're a candidate, and I'm sure everybody on this call would have got a little leaflet to their door with a smiling election candidate on it saying, vote for me. And it'll have a little imprint in the bottom saying who this person is and who paid for the advert. You don't have to do that online. People don't have to do it at all. You can put out any ads you want. You don't have to say who they come from, where they've come from. And what's happened is all we've really got for transparency is a political advert that Facebook runs. So instead of having actual transparency, we've outsourced it to Facebook. And that's pretty much the state of play at the moment, and is unlikely to change massively. What seems to be happening at the moment is the party of government is promising minor changes, or, for example, which if they do them, then will be held up as a great change. So like political adverts will have an imprint if they come from a political party, but already it's quite clear if they do. The problem is third-party adverts. Similarly, with the Electoral Commission, there's a lot of calls for the Electoral Commission to have real teeth. The maximum fine for breaking the law around elections in Britain is £20,000. In the Brexit referendum, the campaign's £7 million to spend. It's ridiculous. The Vote Leave campaign broke the law by overspending more than £500,000 and got fined 20 grand. In what walk of life is finding someone a fifth of what they've done wrong ever going to qualify on retrospectively as a deterrent? And so that's one issue with it. And I think so. But the problem is, while there's a lot of calls for reform, in their submission to the committee looking at this, the Conservatives, as you say, floated the idea of abolishing it. And what I think is probably going to happen is nothing will change, and the fact that it's not abolished will be held out as a kind of sign of great moderation. And I think that's a really kind of gets to the nub of the problem with all these things.
Yeah. Okay, Peter, we're going to come to questions in a minute, but I just wonder, Scottish politics has always occupied a slightly odd position in all of this for a long time after devolution. Scotland's politics kind of went under the radar because Westminster didn't really seem to notice that it had happened. That started to change in 2014-15 with the referendum and then the big surge in support for the SNP. But nonetheless, it's still a very different sort of atmosphere and scene. And particularly at the moment, there might be an opportunity in the fact that we've got a government which is opposed to what's going on at Westminster and is opposed to Brexit. So they might be a bit more open to taking steps that might have prevented some of the abuses there. Then the big surge in support for the SNP. I've really got myself tapping away back at me. That's very distracting. Is there any way to switch that off? Anyway, the question was, what do you think the particular threats in Scotland are, and the particular opportunities, maybe, if there are any, in Scotland might be?
Well, it's interesting, actually. Like, if you look earlier this year, before COVID struck, the Scottish Parliament did pass kind of draft legislation around funding and potential second independence referendum, which I think was a step forward if it ever is actually used, in terms of it increases the fines from the Electoral Commission to £500,000. It would have a lot more transparency in terms of where money comes from and its use in politics, in political campaigning. But the problem with it is it will only qualify. It'll only be donations that are from Scotland that would be subject to this. So donations from the rest of the United Kingdom wouldn't be subject to this new legislation. So that is an issue. And it's one of the challenges, actually, of trying to handle the evolved politics with this. And in many ways, like, if you look at some of the characters who populate my book, people like, Dominic Cummings, people like Topham Guerin, people like Paul Stevenson, who was the director of Vote Leave Communications now at Hanbury Strategy. These are all people that we now know that the British government are talking to about potential second referendum stuff. I think there's a huge potential for the first referendum in Scotland to look very, very different to the second referendum. You know, if the current way of politics was to kind of be part of the second referendum, I think it could look really, really different. I think it would look far more like the Brexit campaign we saw, you know, because these sort of ways of doing politics have become very much mainstreamed into it. There's a lot of reasons to expect some of the kind of people who didn't really donate in 2014, it has to be said, actually. I think the 2014 referendum was kind of seen as much more of a Scotland-only affair. The British government weren't as engaged with it. A lot of it was outsourced to Better Together. I think if you look at the politics of now, I think a future referendum would be very different. I think the No campaign would be led by the British government. And I think you'd see a lot more of the kind of funders who funded both the Brexit campaign, but also the No to AV referendum, which I write about in my book from back in 2011. A lot of the same characters actually recurred. The No to AV referendum was run by Matthew Elliott, who then ran the Brexit campaign. A lot of these same funders were involved. And it's not hard. I don't find it hard to imagine an Aaron Banks type figure looking to spend huge sums of money on a second referendum in Scotland. And I don't think we're there at all in terms of being able to chart that type of money and that type of political spending, because one of the issues in Scotland is that money will go a lot further. So what you have is it's the same rules that apply throughout the United Kingdom, but in terms of disclosures, but actually you can get a lot more. 7,500 is the ceiling for disclosures to political parties. That's very high for Scotland. You get, I couldn't. It's not hard to imagine you getting a lot of access for that without ever having to break that threshold. So there's problems already existing in the legislation, but the wider way of doing political campaigning, which is not what we saw in 2014, that kind of online campaigning, but also just the size and scale with which you can imagine political funds flowing into a campaign, I think are quite worrying. I don't think we're there yet. And I don't think there's any impetus, especially in Westminster, to change this, because the government's been elected on this and through these ways. So I certainly don't see Boris Johnson turning around and wanting to do anything about any of this. He dismissed the Russia report as Islington Remainers, kind of giving out about Remoaners and all the rest of it. So it's very hard to see positive change coming from that. But I think there's a lot of reasons to be very, very fearful about what kind of dynamics might take place in a second independence referendum.
Do you think, just finally,
in regard to defamation,
live streaming is on?
Oh, good. So we're back, are we? Okay, I was just.
Hello.
I
think that we might have.
You want to? Sorry.
To be very, very fearful.
And I think we're streaming again. Hopefully, you're all still with us. I'm sorry for the technical hitches there. We were just hearing from Joyce and Peter. I'll just pass back to Joyce, who was giving Peter a final question there.
Yeah, very final question. Do you think then that there is anything that could be happening through the Scottish Parliament now, given the vested interest of a majority of that Parliament in not having any referendum or future election totally dominated by dark money and sort of dodgy forms of internet campaigning? Do you think there's anything we could be doing now, any kind of legislation that could be brought forward now to try and preempt the impact of that on Scottish politics over the next few years?
There's some things. There's some minor things. I was heartened by the aspects of the Referendum Act and what it suggests to do with the Electoral Commission. I think there's some things you could improve. I think there's stuff you could improve around transparency. There's things you could improve around third-party campaigning. My concern is that probably the SNP is not madly keen to do it, because there was a lot of there was a lot of third-party campaigning during the referendum that I think you could probably, if anyone was to dig into how that operated, would have problems with it in terms of electoral legislation too. And I think that's probably comes back to the thing we spoke about at the start, which is the turkeys voting for Christmas aspect of this, and the concern and the sense in which parties and people feel like even if they're not winning at a national level, they understand how this system works and they think it's worked for them in the past, so they're not minded to change it for the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's something that perhaps campaigners in Scotland could work on, in the sense that there's possibly slightly there's slightly more room for manoeuvre given the political disposition of forces in Scotland at the moment than there maybe is at Westminster, where you've got a government that's categorically been elected by those means and isn't likely to change it. Anyway, let's go to questions from everyone else who's hopefully been listening and not put off by the interruption there. So Karen, have you been monitoring the questions?
Been having a look, and we're just getting a few questions in, so that, you know, a lot of interest in the issue around disinformation and just, you know, what is the challenge of the 21st century, and how really, I suppose both of you think that journalists should continue to cover disinformation as we go forward and it becomes an increasing issue.
I think there's a huge challenge incumbent. I think there's a huge challenge incumbent on journalists to kind of to skill up in this area and to understand a lot more about how this operates. You know, there's a tendency, we've seen this in press in Scotland, you know, in the UK level, wherever it is, to continue to not understand how this disinformation operates and to report it flatly. And by that I mean to go, you know, I saw in one Scottish newspaper not so long ago, they were, you know, kind of, there was a story about David Icke and criticising Nicola Sturgeon for not responding to David Icke's comments. And you're like, this is how disinformation works. This is exactly what people like David Icke want you to do, which is to report their comments as if they are as if they are akin to the comments of the First Minister of Scotland. And this is, I think, journalists need to get a lot smarter. American journalists, I think, have been forced to do this. If you look at 2016, if you look at what happened in the run-up to the American presidential election 2016, where WikiLeaks, where basically Russian hackers hacked DNC, the Democratic National Convention National Committee emails of John Podesta, released them out, and then journalists just reported them flat. That's not happening now in America. There's a lot more. Journalists are now asking way, way more questions about where information is coming from. And leaks are no longer seen as just value-neutral things that happen. And they're seen as potential disinformation events. In the same way that information that circulates online is a potential disinformation event. It has to be, I think it's incumbent on journalists to do more to check where that information comes from and do a lot more to caveat it and contextualize it. And in that way, I think that's really, really super important. I agree. I think it's probably the important issue this time. And not to just report things flatly. You know, it's the same way we saw it with Boris Johnson this week in Parliament, in which he said the Sadiq Khan had bankrupted Transport for London. That is not true. You will not find anybody who's an expert in that area who will tell you it's true. And it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge to do this in a way that is not partisan. Because it can come across as partisan. Like, you know, for example, I think the Guardian's American reporting is really poor now because it's very partisan. They talk about Trump in news reporting in a very partisan way. I think that puts me off as a reader. And I don't think it's about, I think it's a really difficult balancing act. I think for journalists, it's not about laying your hand on the till with this stuff. It's not about saying, you know, Boris Johnson is wrong and he's a liar and all the rest of it. But it is about really contextualizing this information and not contextualizing a paragraph 5. Not having Boris Johnson says that Sadiq Khan has said this. Sadiq Khan hits out at him, and then 5 paragraphs down, you have an independent expert telling you that what Boris Johnson is saying is not true. There's and that's how this is misinformation. In that instance, you could be polite and call it misinformation, which is information that's wrong, but not necessarily intended to. It's not created to intend to mislead. To give Boris Johnson the benefit of the doubt in that instance. Disinformation is information that is incorrect and is intentionally being put out there to spread and fuel, And we're seeing a lot of that around COVID. Actual disinformation campaigns trying to say like a vaccine is going, it's a vaccine is an attempt to chip people so they're kind of, they can be controlled or something. That's disinformation. But I think in general, journalists, because we've always relied on this giving both sides thing, and you give both sides of a story. But the problem with disinformation is by giving both sides to disinformation, you amplify it and magnify it, and you do not contextualize it.
Yeah, and I think the whole question of how you try to do impartiality in a situation where one side is simply lying or misinforming, unintentionally, is a really difficult one. There was quite an interesting edition of that radio program this week. They called the Red Lines, I think it's called, or Across the Lines, is it? Where they have 2 people with a very different point of view, and they had James O'Brien and Roger Mosey, who's a kind of long time BBC guy, arguing about impartiality. and it was very, very interesting. And it's an almost irresolvable problem, because the method of journalism does require you to stand back from a story and get both sides, as Peter said. But at the same time, I don't think any serious journalist can really be impartial between lies and truth. You know, if Sadiq Khan says, I have actually reduced the deficit of Transport for London, and that's true, and Boris Johnson says, no, he's bankrupted Transport for London, and that's a porky, which is what, of course, is normally expected from Boris Johnson, then, you know, I don't think a responsible journalist can just report those as if they're both equal, you know, remarks. You have to find a way of saying, you know, this is true and this isn't true. And you can begin to hear just sometimes, not so much in the sort of general news bulletins, but in the more kind of, you know, analytical BBC reporting, you can hear people beginning to try and find ways of doing that. They've stopped giving equal weight to climate deniers and climate scientists, for instance. The BBC have stopped doing that now. And that was a big step forward, when they realised they really didn't need to have a climate denier on every time they had somebody saying there was a problem with global warming, you know. But in a way, it just tells us how much our presumptions about impartiality were shaped by a world in which most people were playing by some kind of gentleman's rules. That you didn't just tell outright lies and expect to pay no price for it. And once somebody starts playing beyond those rules, certainly the method of impartiality doesn't work the way it used to, and you have to change your approach to it, I think.
Fantastic. It's really interesting. We have a lot of really in-depth conversations at the Ferret, I suppose, about impartiality and about creating a journalism that's really fit for the 21st century.
It's hard.
It is. It's a big challenge. I suppose what we really want to do as well at the Ferret is to build a team who have the time and the resources to do that more sort of in-depth, contextualized journalism that I know from bitter experience is hard to do when you're on a desk and you've got a just incredible number of deadlines and amount of work to get through. So there's lots of challenges in 21st century journalism for sure around this. There's another question around defamation, which I know that you talked about, Peter, but in terms of, you know, how maybe we can broaden it out to how defamation legislation in Scotland affects your work, and whether there are European states that have got better or more protective for investigative journalists, and other things that Scotland could be aspiring to there.
I'm only aware of Ireland, which is much, much, much worse. The Republic of Ireland is absolutely appalling. Like, it's just shocking. You can get, and it runs into millions. You can get millions of payouts. Like, it has closed newspapers in Ireland, and it's closed ordinary citizens. So unfortunately, I'm aware of Ireland, and Northern Ireland hasn't had defamation before. I'm quite pleased. I must say, I'm pleased. Like, we're not there yet in Scotland, but the defamation, like, what the Scottish Government is proposing on defamation, I'm broadly supportive of. I did give evidence to, and we have too, we've been involved in that process, and I was personally, and I think it is a step it's very much a step in the right direction. I think, you know, in terms of providing more protection for journalists, there's obviously more. There's further you can go with it. But that was good. I think, you know, limiting payouts would be a very useful starting point. That would make life a lot easier, I think, and being much more, you know, like, as I say, in Ireland it's particularly bad, but we still also do have in the UK too. There is a potential for kind of really difficult, you know, payouts that are just going to bankrupt people, and it is something we rub up against all the time in our work. It seems across Europe, have got a huge amount of knowledge of lots of different contexts. It seems to be an incredibly variable thing. I was reading about in Thailand, and in Thailand, defamation, you can go into prison for like 10 or 15 years for defamation. And there's a man who was in a Thai prison for writing a negative TripAdvisor review. And apparently, what American man? So, like, and defamation is a tool that's used by the powerful to stop people saying things that they do not want to hear. And that in itself is something I think that should be is a cause for huge concern. So I think, you know, there's further we could go with it, but I am pleased to see that finally we should have some defamation reform in Scotland.
Fantastic. Joyce, do you have any comments?
No. I don't have anything to add to what Peter said.
Okay,
with a lot of
fantastic.
experience of this.
We've also got a question about the BBC. I wonder if Ali, I'm not logged on to the stream. Could you just help me out with that there just now? Don't know if he can. With that,
yeah, I'm here. So Jen Stout has asked a couple of questions.
Hi, Jen.
So Jen Stout has asked. She is asking.
Hi, Jen.
Hang on a minute. I've got a duplicate sound too. Bear with me a second.
That's why mine has been closed, because of that technical difficulty. If you mute your stream.
There we are.
That's you.
Terrifying, isn't it? My apologies, everybody. So Jen Stout has asked whether basically how we can campaign better and save the Beeb, and do so with journos and not making them feel under siege. And another question kind of related to that is, do we need to explain how and why we do things as journalists and make decisions? Do we need to show how the sausage is made? That's not what Jen said. That's me summarising.
While Peter's thinking about that, I could say that on the sausage is made question, we've actually my NUJ branch has been holding weekly meetings throughout, which Rob Edwards also belongs to, has been holding weekly meetings throughout the COVID crisis, because it's a freelance branch, and we thought it'd be good for the members to have something to keep in touch with during the crisis. And this is one of the subjects that we've touched on, because apparently in some European countries there are quite elaborate initiatives going on to kind of educate the public in how journalists work, and how the what the actual content of their job ideally is, and how it should function in a democracy. And one of the ideas that was rolled out was that journalists should sort of give live performances. Obviously can't do that at the moment, but journalists should sort of do a form of theatre where there's like 3 or 4 journalists on stage, and they explain to a live audience what they've been doing, the stories they've been doing, and the processes that they've gone through to work. And apparently this is incredible. It's become like a form of storytelling in Finland, that people really, really enjoy it. And so, I mean, it just shows you how very far we are really from that in sort of British culture around journalism, that nobody would even think of that here, or at least hadn't up till now. And there's someone working at Hull University on trying to open it up now. So, there are ideas about that, and about trying to explain. There's certainly, I mean, one of the things that has really emerged from our discussions is the need for there to be more public education about the importance of journalism in society, and the way that it interacts with democracy. How you can't just let journalism die if you want to have a functioning democracy. And no matter how angry you are with individual journalists or individual broadcasting organizations or newspapers, you have to have systems that make it possible for journalism to survive. And of course, in a lot of European countries, there is a longer and stronger tradition of supporting journalism. I think simply because they're not in the sort of English-speaking journalistic world, which is so wedded to ideas about the free market and just letting it roll, So yes, it's quite interesting, and there is more that can be done, I think, to incorporate ideas about the importance of journalism into any civic education that people get. Although obviously that's one of the things that's under pressure. I'll let Peter chat on about.
I always think it's really tempting. It's really tempting to kick the BBC bash. I think it's the thing that people get really into, and they can all think the BBC did this or that. They call Jeremy Corbyn great, or they call Boris Johnson great. I always think that's just. I feel like it's a complete red herring. I feel like it's often like the people who are wanting to cut the BBC's funding are not wanting to do it because they want a different BBC, or they wanted to do different things. They want it because they want less BBC and they want less public service broadcasting. I think that's always a bad thing for people. I think what a lot of people who should be saying is they want the BBC to do more things in depth. I think that's what I want to see more. I think that's the thing that is missing. It's not what words are used to describe a particular political situation, or or what phrases are used on Question Time or whatever else. I think it's moving. I think I personally like to see less Question Time shoutiness and more in-depth interrogation of issues and of things that matter to people, whether that's, you know, long-form documentary, whether that's, you know, and the BBC does do some of this stuff, but I think it's almost like putting it front and center more as well. You know, I'm always amazed at how much good BBC content I miss, how much good BBC content just doesn't get enough airtime, you know, and I think that's the thing that, like, I feel like if people saw themselves reflected more in what they consume, and that's expensive. And this is my big concern about what's happening at the BBC in terms of cost cutting. If you look at something like Inside Out, which is a really good investigative regional program made out of Bristol mainly, or was, did a lot of good investigative journalism, and it was Inside Out, like, for different regions of England, a lot, you know, very, very good investigative journalism. That's all been centralised into Birmingham now, and it's like, I think it's got 3 members of staff overseeing 150 hours of television a year, and the the cost per episode has fallen through the roof floor. They're almost certainly going to move away from doing investigations into what they're going to call investigations, but they're really just going to be lifestyle programs because it's original content, so they're going to badge it as investigations. So there's a huge, that to me is the real problem, is that people see themselves less and less reflected in what they're listening to and what they're seeing, and then they become further and further away from. I think if you get outside the political realms of, like, kind of Twitter arguments, I think that's what people are really find most, like, that's the bit, I think, when it comes to the BBC, that, you know, there's lots of space for political commentary, there's lots of space for political fulmination. You know, and obviously there's times where I do wish the BBC could be better. My big bugbear is think tanks, is bringing guests on from think tanks and badging them as experts. And they're rent-a-gobs who will say anything. And I do think that's a huge problem. And if I had one thing with the BBC I would change, it would be that. And it would be asking them who funds who. And I think that is the one thing I would massively have a big problem with. And that aside, I think it's actually about, you know, promoting the BBC to do more, you know, more international content. I think that's and I think that's what the people who want to kind of downsize the BBC. And I think we need to be wary in Scotland. I think in Scotland there's a real culture of BBC bashing. It's become very ingrained, very politically ingrained. I would be very worried about that. I do not think it's healthy. I do not think that's a good thing to see.
Okay, thanks very much. There's a few comments there, no more questions, but, you know, people talking about issues around the problem with BBC is that they're very slow to catch up on certain issues like climate change and around balance. And I think that kind of ties in sometimes, Peter, with what you're saying about the very high profile shows like Question Time, the sort of shouty ones where actually a lot of the think tank people are attending, that maybe people are seeing those much more, they're much more high profile, and things like Inside Out, which is fantastic, are maybe just less known and less seen. So that's really interesting comments. And some comments as well around defamation, people talking about the Netherlands, so you might want to have a look at some of the other places that are being highlighted in the comments there. But really, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Joyce for coming along. You can read Peter's book, Democracy for Sale, which is out now in every good bookshop and online. And, you know, don't forget your local independent bookshop people, who I'm sure can order it for you if they don't have it in stock. So thanks a lot, Joyce, and thanks, Peter. We're just going to go back to talking through what lies ahead for the Ferret, and then Ali is going to look at our reader survey in a little bit more depth and how we're responding to that. So yeah, thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Karen. It's been great to be here. Thank you. Good luck with the rest of the thing. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So we're going to go back to some of what has been going on at the Ferret. We've talked a lot about what has been in the year before. So we'd like to look really ahead at what we've got coming up for the Ferret now. It's been a year, of course, like no other so far. As we said before, the pandemic is bringing us huge challenges that we could never have imagined. But we've also got quite a lot of exciting developments coming up. So we hope, I suppose, that as a member of the Ferret, you think that we can do things differently. We were founded in 2015 by Rob Edwards, Peter Gahan, Ali Tibbett, Billy Briggs and Rachel Hamada, who wanted to really focus in on in-depth news and investigations in the public good. So we've been through some of the things we've done over that in the last year, and we'll look at what we're doing going forward. But with one of the really key things we want to do is to build and grow our membership. So we're 5 years on and we have nearly 1,800 standard and gold members. When you add on sponsored members and Ferret Underground members, that jumps to over 2,300. So it's taking us a long way towards sustainability with your help. But we want to go much further than that. So we were delighted earlier this year to get a substantial Luminate grant for 3 years in April. And that's really going to help us to focus on doing that. So one key thing that we're doing this year is recruiting a business manager, initially for 2 days a week. It might sound quite dry, but actually this is going to be quite a critical thing in helping us grow and develop, to get new partnerships, to get new schemes going, to reach more people. So please do remember to let your friends and family know that they can subscribe and help us to grow. The most important thing, I suppose, is still producing those great investigations. So I've been seeing some comments coming up along the stream about what's been important to people, things like fish farming, Hunterston, as Rob commented. Don't worry, we are continuing to look at those into next year and beyond. People have been kind about our coverage of the asylum system and about solutions journalism, and that's something that we've been talking about as well, as we develop the types of content that we produce. We've been doing podcasts, we're looking at more audio and visual content in times to come, and of course Brexit is coming up in 2021 and the Scottish elections in the following year, in that year as well, and we'll be looking really at beefing up our political coverage to make sure that we bring our members and readers everything they need to know there. We really do depend on our members to help us investigate, so please get in touch with tips, and please do go to ideas.theferret.scot to tell us what we should be investigating next. We've got some major investigations that are already working on. Obviously, we can't say too much about those. I will say that Rob Edwards is going to be busy in the next few months. And we're also building up our work on housing, homelessness, the private rental market. So keep an eye out there too. We're a small team, but we've got a growing number of freelancers. So do get in touch with all your ideas and tips so that we can follow up and really, you know, the Ferret is your organisation. It's a media organisation that's about its readers and its members. So, you know, we're delighted to work with you to do that. On that note, I would like to introduce Ali, if he's around just now, to just tell us a little bit more about the readers survey that we've been doing. And this has been a pretty important bit of work, Ali, hasn't it, in understanding?
It has. Now, we're going to conclude the meeting in death by PowerPoint because it's the bit that you've always been waiting for. I'll try and do it quickly. Can everybody see that? Maybe, maybe not. Oh, I don't know. I'm just waiting to see if it comes through on the live feed before I proceed, because there's a little bit of a delay and it's a little bit confusing when you watch both at the same time. Let's see. Hooray, it's working. Good. So, where was I? Yes. So this year, for the first time, we did we have done reader surveys in the past, and we have set up things this year like ideas.theferret.scot where people can add in story tips. We tried to collect as much data as we can from things like Google Analytics and what have you to try and understand our audience. But really, we haven't. We thought we'd take this opportunity this year to try and do as big a survey as we could of our members to get a little bit more feedback about what they think about the Ferret. And so the numbers. What we've got here is a rudimentary analysis. There's a lot more information actually in the survey, which we haven't had a chance to crunch yet. So one of the first jobs for our new crop of directors is going to be to really get into the roots of some of this stuff. But as you can see, this analysis is based on the views of 166 people, 96 of whom said they were paying members, 34 said they were casual readers, and then one person who has given a donation, and a few other folk on social media and what have you. So it's quite a good mixture of people. one of the things we wanted to do was find out what else they read. And from this chart, you can see that actually the Ferret seems to exist in an intersection between the Guardian, the National, and some quality, the BBC, as well as Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, the Times, and the Scotsman. So there's a really big, you would probably expect those big brands, but it's an interesting mix of stuff. And then we asked people what other publications they support financially. Obviously, we're interested to see who else our readers give money to. And again, you can see there's a really interesting mix of Private Eye, the National, the Guardian. These are some of the organisations which have been asking for digital subscriptions for the longest. And obviously, Private Eye, if you want to get, is barely online at all. So if you want to get their information, then you have to subscribe. And then further down the list, there's a really interesting mix of Scottish independent news, UK independent news, things like Tortoise and Double Down, but also other international quality titles like New York, established mainstream media, things like the New York Times and the Financial Times. And interesting to see there's a bit of cooperative solidarity there with the West Highland Free Press appearing in the list of things that other people subscribe to. This is really interesting information for us, partly because there's sort of wider research which shows that people tend to have one news subscription, or at least a small population of the a small proportion of the population tend to subscribe to news, and of those they only tend to have one subscription. So it's quite interesting to see who else people are subscribing to. Then we asked people where they get news about Scotland, because obviously that's our niche. And given that we're a digital publication, it's probably no surprise that more than, the top source, more than half of news is sourced for our readers from online. Social media is the biggest slice, and news websites are the next biggest slice. Between them, they make up more than half of the sources of news. It's quite surprising actually how far down the list TV news and newspapers are. Obviously, these things are kind of left to these things. When people are watching TV news, are they watching it online or are they watching it on TV? And you could say the same about newspapers, but nevertheless, it's pretty interesting. And email comes in there at 7%. And that's one of these trends which we're seeing a lot of media organizations jump on the back of, is people are producing more and more email newsletters too. We asked what apps people use, and the list that we kind of consulted people on here was mainly inspired by where we see people, like referral traffic coming from onto our website, but also like a lot of websites, as security is tightened up, and people's web traffic is more and more encrypted. We also see a lot of what's called dark traffic. It's traffic where we can't identify it on our website. So one of the reasons that we wanted to ask this question was to kind of try and unpick a little bit about where our readers are most likely to be, and possibly unsurprisingly, Twitter and Facebook are atop the list. But there's also YouTube and Instagram coming in there quite significantly, I think, as well. And certainly, I think this tends to reflect also a demographic change where more and more, younger people tend to be on Instagram and YouTube. So that's definitely social media sites that we're going to need to have a think about upping our presence on. We also asked about podcasts, partly because we are developing our own podcast. And again, the 76, so not a lot of people actually said that they don't listen to podcasts. So to some extent, podcasts are still something of a niche area, I think. But about half of the people said they did listen to a podcast. And you can see, in a way, it's quite interesting. You might have heard, you've probably almost certainly heard of More or Less on the BBC. For all the people who follow us and value our fact-checking content, it's probably not surprising that chimes. And similarly, Leslie Riddick's podcast, it doesn't really surprise me that that comes up on the list, simply because people, anybody who's interested in Scottish politics, which the Ferret covers, is probably also going to be interested in what Leslie Riddick has to say. The third one was an interesting one, though. That's a huge international hit. Ear Hustle kind of almost reflects the kind of social justice editorial that we publish, because Ear Hustle is a podcast based on experiences from people in US prisons. And it's really interesting if you ever have a chance to listen to it. But that certainly gives us food for thought. And we'd certainly, as we develop our ideas for a monthly or more podcast for the Ferret going forwards, the suggestions, the wider data is really useful for us. Not least because we're interested in figuring out how we can cross-promote our podcast with other people's podcasts. So another thing, you might have seen that we tweeted this yesterday as a little promotion. We also asked in the reader survey what 3 words people would use to describe the Ferret, and lots of words beginning with I came back. Informative, independent, investigative, impartial, intelligent. So that's kind of interesting. There's pleasingly positive. Obviously, this is a self-selecting group of people who have taken part in the survey, but I think we can take the positive feedback where we can. There are also some less positive words, which I think we also need to consider as well. Something like, people said we are niche and shoestring and discomforting. And obviously news isn't always comforting, unfortunately, but it's certainly, we've often talked about what's called solutions journalism, where you try to present the solutions as well as the problems when we write. So that also gives us some food for thought. Again, continuing that positive theme, lots of people rated us when we asked how much people are likely to recommend us to other people. It was pleasing to see that the majority of people at least gave us 8 out of 10, if not more. It's really important to us, word of mouth, because simply because the Ferret doesn't have a huge marketing budget. So if you can, anybody watching this, if you can recruit your friends and family or work acquaintances to become a subscriber to the Ferret, we'd really appreciate that. But again, this is a useful, we actually ask people quite often in a separate rolling survey to give us marks out of 10 and give us some qualitative feedback. And you can see here are some of the things that people said. I won't read them all out, but the people, you can, again, it underlines, I think, that people really value the fact that we hold people to account, that our standards are pretty high, especially when it comes to things like environmental reporting, and essentially our commitment to holding power to account and punching up. So that seems to be what resonates with people. We also ask people to rate which aspects of the Ferret output that they most value and which they least value. Now you'll see, I don't know if you can see from the numbers on the screen there, a lot of people actually declined to answer the second question about what they least value, and gave comments along the lines of, they might not enjoy every single story that we publish, but they value the whole package, and understand that, we need to obviously move beyond just tackling a core set of subjects. Interestingly, fact checks came out as the most valued content that we publish, and I think that gives us stuff to think about as we move into a Scottish election year. And I'm sure Alistair Bryan, who coordinates our fact-checking work, will be delighted to see that. The aspect of our output that people least valued, people said, was international stories, and I think we probably ought to reflect on that too. Having said that, one of the reasons historically that we've kind of published the occasional international story is because, generally speaking, we tend to find Scottish media don't do as much of that as they used to. So we kind of think that there's a bit of a gap in there. And this one I think is really interesting. One of our slogan is good journalism changes things, but one question that I don't think media organizations ask enough especially when they're talking about public interest news and trying to justify funding for public interest news, is what difference does journalism make? Our slogan is "Good journalism changes things," and so we asked people what they did after reading a Ferret story, and I think there's some really interesting ones in there. So a third of readers say that they've donated to a campaign. Nearly 2/3 say they've signed a petition. Nearly a quarter say that they've changed their views on things, which I think is also a really important function of public interest news, is to challenge people's preconceptions about things. More than a fifth of people have said they've submitted views to a consultation, and again, about a fifth of people have said they changed their buying habits. So people are really being inspired by the Ferret to participate in what you might call civic life, one way or another, and I think that's really reassuring for journalists, the journalists involved, and also I think it really helps to underpin the case for public interest news. It's not something which is detached from the wider public discussion by any means, and this shows that people really are motivated by well-written news. So that's a really key slide and a really key outcome for us. It will help us to obtain more grant funding in the future, and I hope it will also inspire more people to join us too, for that matter. And to finish up, I've rabbited on for long enough now. To finish up, we asked a load of questions about advertising. I think earlier on in the presentation, I touched on that idea that there's a small percentage of people who seem to be willing to pay for news, and of those people, of that small percentage, there's an even smaller percentage of people who generally have more than one news subscription. So now more and more news organizations are chasing reader revenue because advertising revenue has collapsed for them. It almost feels as though if they're zigging, perhaps we should consider zagging as a means to generate a little bit more incremental revenue. So we asked the question, should the Ferret use advertising to generate additional revenue? And interestingly, nearly 3/4 of people said yes, you should consider it. But they also said paying members shouldn't be shown adverts. And one of the reasons that we were interested in asking that question, as well as just the idea of generating additional revenue, was some discussions that we've had with other publishers, and in particular some local publishers in the north of England, who see what they call an ethical advertising policy as very much part of what they do. And now in our reader survey, we asked loads and loads of questions about what kind of things an ethical advertising policy might look like, what it might rule out and what it might rule in. I haven't gone into the detail of that there, but you can see here that there's a pretty overwhelming support for an ethical advertising policy, and also for the reader directors of the Ferret to sort of own that. And I think that's an interesting thing as well. So the reason the Ferret has reader directors is really to hold the journalist directors to account, whether that's through adjudicating on complaints or other kinds of compliance stuff. So this could be another thing which the reader directors get involved in, which is basically assessing whether advertisers are appropriate for us or comply with the ethical advertising policy, and setting the direction of travel in that regard. And last but not least, we also asked, what could we do better or improve on? And I think there are some really interesting responses to this, and certainly loads of food for thought with regards to what we can do more in the future. First of all, people asked for more reader engagement and something like short blogs or letters from the readership to be incorporated in the site somewhere. So that's something for us to consider. And then there are a lot of people who said that they wanted more content one way or another. So that's whether writing more or basically publishing more stuff. Obviously that has a resource implication, but it's something that we're acutely conscious of. Our output does has increased year on year. So we're almost publishing one story a day on average now. But we certainly recognise that we would like to do more if we had the resources to do it. There are a couple of questions about pricing. So somebody said, is it possible to just pay £1 to read an article when I need to rather than subscribe? And other people, there are actually a few people saying that we're selling ourselves short and why don't you put your prices up? So I can confirm that we are likely to put our prices up rather than down. But we will still keep our sponsored membership for people on low incomes. When it comes to what I call micropayments, when people just pay £1 to read one article, to be honest, I'm still not convinced about that. Partly because the payment processing fees are really, if you charge somebody £1 for something, then you basically lose it all to PayPal. Or whoever you're using as your payment gateway. So there's really not very much in it for us. And we think £3 for a month is probably better value for everybody involved. There are lots of people who talked about our marketing. So there's clearly a desire for us to improve our marketing. A lot of people saying that we're just not high profile enough. Obviously, we'd like to be higher profile. And we can always do better in that regard. And there are also a few people questioning, our slogans and our logo, and a few people think that the Ferret logo kind of devalues what we do. So I don't know if a rebrand is in a possibility this year, but it certainly gives us food for thought to move on to. And then loads of people said, could we have a printed product of some kind? So we can go back and think about that. There's obviously a load of costs associated with producing a printed paper. So that's quite an interesting possibility. And last but not least, a few people also commented on the user experience and the navigation of the website. We have just jumped into a slight redesign of the site, but there's clearly a lot more to do there. And actually, we don't have a professional web developer on tap, so because they cost lots of money. So if there are people out there with WordPress skills who want to pitch in, then we're all ears as far as all that goes. And on that note, I should say, any questions? And I think I will stop sharing my screen. There we go. Sorry for talking at everybody for 20 minutes.
Thanks, Ali. It was really interesting. We don't have any questions specifically, just people making some comments, encouraging us to make better use of social media, which we've talked about in terms of Twitter and Instagram, and we'll be building our capacity to do that. Some enthusiasm for a Ferret podcast, which both me and Ali share that enthusiasm, so we hope to have more of that. I think unless you've got any further comments to make, Ali, maybe we should just draw to a close. And just thank everyone so much for their time and for coming along. I wish very much that we could all have been in a room today. Our Ferret members and readers really are important to us as part of our Ferret community. We feel really pleased with what we've built in the last 5 years. We know we've got a long way to go, and we really rely on your help to do that. Really encourage you as well to make the best use you can of your Ferret membership. We've not even talked about the training courses that we have available in FOI, and we're hoping to have one in fact checking. There are podcasts to listen to, and there's quite a few there in the last few months that you can go back and have a listen to if you've not already done so. There's all of our stories on all the different topics, which you might have noticed are rearranged in our slightly refreshed website so that you can go into your kind of topic of choice, post us your ideas, and take a look at the stats and figures in both the annual report and on our dashboard, which is available on our website as well. Ali, have I missed anything?
No, I don't think so. I think, I would encourage everybody to get as much as, especially with the training. So one thing that we'd really like everybody to pitch into, if they have the time and interest, is to go through the FOI training. There's an amazing offer from My Society where you get 6 months free access to their professional FOI tools, software to keep you on track. If you can dig up anything which we haven't thought of, using your newfound FOI superpowers at the end of the course, we'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Just as well, just to say that, you know, we think that we are really competitively priced, and that is something for us to think about. But if there is anybody that's struggling to afford a membership, that should never be exclude them from reading our stories. Please get in touch. We have some sponsored memberships available for people on no or low income. So that's another thing for you to bear in mind. Thanks again to Peter and to Joyce and to Ali for presenting the reader survey, and to all of our directors for joining us. We really look forward to working with them all in the next year. And thank you so much for coming along to our online AGM. We hope to see you in real life sometime soon. Bye.
Oh, and don't forget to vote if you're a paying member. You've been sent the link for the thing. Thanks.
Bye for now.